Here, this is the session we're rethinking early and anticipatory and any other actions to better manage shocks. Yeah, and what we have is a fantastic set of different presentations. This is probably going to be the most interesting session of the whole 2 days. No pressure on anybody else. We're going to start with a framing. Jaso is going to really explain to us why it is so important that we look differently, and maybe it's around these mindsets that we heard about. It's the new impetus, it's the narratives. Why does this matter, and who does it matter for? Then we've got 5 short presentations for you, and you can see on the sheet here, we're going to hear from Tahira, who spoke earlier. We're going to hear from Natasha, and I'm keeping it very informal because I know probably you followed my instructions and you met each other in the coffee break. So everybody will already know everybody. Then we're going to hear from Alex, and then from Nelly, and then from Sam. So the idea is 5 short presentations giving us different windows onto this question around what rethinking, re-mindsetting, new narratives. And then we've got 2 colleagues. We've invited Kadar and Kuyo, who work for different organizations, to give their different perspectives. So what does this mean for them? Then we're going to make you work. So you're going to have to listen carefully. You shouldn't be doing too many emails. You should be listening very attentively, because we're going to make you work briefly. And then we're going to synthesize and wrap everything up. That's the process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over now, and we have presentations from everybody. We're looking for really only 5 minutes, and I have all the presentations here, and I think this is just so. What's important for you all to know, also the colleagues who are speaking, this is being recorded, and there are some people watching online. So you need to speak clearly into the microphone, and you can move the slides. So Jaso, I'm going to hand over to you. Since you're the framer, I will introduce you properly. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Dryland Learning and Capacity Initiative, which is a civil society organization here. It is also the Secretariat of the Kenya government, the Parliamentary Pastoralist Group. So this is a place that kind of swings between capacity and policy and evidence and advocacy. And he just, I'm not allowed to, he's actually an early career researcher. He just completed his PhD. So before we start, let's give a big round of applause for the PhD candidate, who is no longer a candidate. Jaso, can you frame us, please?
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'll just keep time, 10 minutes
okay.
or so.
That's too much. Thank you, Peter. I just want to give you a bit of the frame of this session, thinking about why drylands are and pastoralists, this thing, rethinking, early action in the drylands. Why is it important? Why is it different? Why it matters? Just a quick one. And basically just give you an understanding of unique challenges and importance the drylands societies. So basically, it's not going to be a lot of work, but the work will come after the 5 presentations are done. I expected them actually to sit here, but I will call them one after the other. So in the context of Kenya, Kenya is actually a dryland. We have 80% of the land classified as drylands. It has about 30% population, but the area is big. I didn't give you, for those of you who are not familiar with Kenya, I should have given you the map, but it is the country. The country of Kenya is actually a dryland. It's supporting all the pastoralists, and it is vital to the national culture and economy, because 90% of all our wildlife is in that drylands. Well, most of the livestock that we have is also in the drylands. So the drylands are very important strategic space for Kenya, and it's Kenya actually. If you remember the speech from the PS, where he's saying these are strategic national assets, that's true. And it is central to the resilience, biodiversity, and regional stability. So drylands in Kenya is actually not marginal. In the past, people are saying drylands were marginal, but they are not. They're actually the main, it's the country. There are misconceptions about drylands in the past, in the literature, that it's often misrepresented as a crisis zone. Small incident happens, and that defines the whole area from all the way from Turkana to Mandera. And these are conceptions which are done, misconceptions which are done in the media. And sometimes it overshadows those small stories about incidences that happen, overshadows the innovation that's going on, the development potential that's there. And the opportunities are huge. It is only in those dryland areas where I can tell you with confidence. I go to the village, I park my car, I don't lock it. I have everything there. And nothing will happen to it 7 days. If you try that in Nairobi in 10 minutes, it's not the valuables, you won't even find the car. But that story you can find in the mainstream. But when a small incident happens in the drylands, it's the headline. That has been part of the problem that has been submerging the opportunities. There's unique opportunities in the drylands around issues of climate resilience, the ecology. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's opportunity for inclusive growth. We can do a lot of, for example, the investment in the livestock sector is almost nothing, but we are contributing 10, 12% of GDP of agriculture. At one time, we were suggesting, just don't do anything. Stop all these things you are doing in the name of development. We will contribute more. What about if we invest? I think we'll be able to achieve more. The other one is that we all know, this is from the researchers, pastoralism is very adaptive. It uses the mobility strategy, ecological knowledge that for many years, for many centuries, pastoralists are very good at using the variability of the climate. They do many things, including, the way they manage the herd, the seasonal migration, the strong community connections, and supporting each other. For example, my herd is in 5 places. My animals are not all with me. They are in 5 different places with, even those places they are in with different people. These are all part of the strategies. So that this is part of the issue around policy. This has a lot of implication for the policy. Currently, I think we have made progress in Kenya. Pastoralism is now being recognized as a dynamic food system. It is also, policymakers are also now working a lot on it. If you remember, the PS was talking about the leadership summit in Wajir, which happened last year. That has now become a blueprint or a government policy document that is implemented centrally, coordinated by a State Department. So the issue is that the understanding, the mainstreaming, the contribution that the pastoralism can do to the food system, if that is mainstream, we are very sure, at least for Kenya, we know we can double our GDP. Only from one sector. And there are a lot of other opportunities there, minerals, carbon trading. Just 2 days ago, we had a meeting between communities and investors, looking at opportunities where communities that have registered their land can actually partner with people with capital to be able to make profits. So why early action? And there are currently limitations within the system of early warning, often that fails to focus really on the need of the people in the drylands. It's framed sometimes by ideas which are from population that are sedentary. And the prediction about the shock is not very accurate sometimes. So these are some of the limitations. The complexity of drought in the drylands also is the fact that the process is slow. It is multi-seasonal, stress impact along many livelihoods and social and economic system, but often it is looked at through one narrow system and then generalized. So these are some of the limitations. So we're recommending that there's need for focusing and scaling up the anticipatory action, where effective early action requires anticipatory approaches using local intelligence and also communities themselves monitoring the system and feeding this into the system of prediction and building long-term resilience. We are saying early action needs to fit into the realities of the pastoralist, so to enable timely, effective intervention and for building resilience. And finally, the issue around governance and the question of land. Land tenure matters in the dryland. One of the questions which is problematic is that there's no security for those land for communities to be able really to focus on it. Traditionally and customarily, they know they own it, but the legal framework have now just been put in place. For example, I support communities to register land, and we have 200 applications over the last 9 years for communities to register their land. We only managed to register 15 because the focus is not around helping those communities really to secure land. And where communities have secure land, investments are getting attracted to that. More discussion around the potential and resources around that land is opening up. And the role of traditional governance is not being strengthened. It's traditionally, it has been a bit silent. This needs to be recognized in the policy frameworks and legal frameworks, so that the traditional governance structures are mainstreamed to take care of the issues of peace, facilitating the strategies of mobility, ensuring that the use and sharing of natural resources are governed through a system that is recognized by all. Because one of the problems is the communities will agree on this, government officers sitting in the office will agree something else and impose things, and it triggers conflict. So I've talked about the significance of the security of the land. There are the other issues around the impact of ignoring those local governance system, which has really increased a lot of this inter-community conflict that interrupts the process and also break down, sometimes divide or bring communities to clash with each other. And finally, the implication for policies and investment is that the policies need to be tailored to the way the traditional system over years have developed, especially for question around mobilities, community land rights, the climate variability, the unique nature of the way pastoralists manage this. The other implication for the policies and investment is the question around ethical, inclusive, and responsible investment, which I think the conversation is at very early stage, where investment strategies should align with the community's values, avoiding the strategies which are mainly focused on extractions that harms the resilience. So if this conversation takes place between communities and investors and policymakers, all this is getting realigned. And then finally, focusing resilience should a bit focus, the focus of the resilience on should shift away, I think, from this heavy focus on aid, where I think it's defined by the crisis that happened. There's a small incident here, the whole strategy for the whole region is designed around that incident. And instead of it becoming understanding the general dryland area, the vulnerability or even the way that area is different from the other, and be proactive and have a focused plan and build around involving the communities and pastoralists as co-designers of that in the different places. This group may design something differently from the other one, The biggest problem is generalization. We do a small pocket research here and then amplify that research and cover the whole area. It works in that place, but it doesn't work in many other places. So there's need to do a lot of work. This easy way of doing things from one angle is part of the problem. And finally, I think I want to say that we need to rethink early warning so that it is anticipatory, locally led, responsive to the dryland challenges. Should be pastoralist led, investment in resilience initiative where communities already adapted practices and capacities are integrated into that, and engage pastoralists as equal partners in program design and implementation of those inclusive development initiatives. That we say will unlock the dryland potential, will support the system that's working, and we'll see a lot of innovation coming up from different places, and we can put that together and scale it, and that will help to grow this resilience scale and be able to have a bigger impact on the land. Thank you. And yes, thank you very much.
We're going to move on now, and we're going to give you 5 short presentations. After the presentations, we will get some commentary, and then we will talk some more. I'm just getting you warmed up. So guys, now is the time to stop talking again. Now is the time to listen and watch. I'm going to introduce Tahira. Tahira is, you can see, she works for the Jameel Observatory, she works for ILRI, and the research she's going to be sharing was conducted jointly funded by the Jameel Observatory and the Spark program. So this is a nice instance of collaboration. So I really need you now to wrap up your conversations. That was just to get your brain cells, talking cells moving. And Tahira, you have 5 minutes, please, to give us
7 minutes.
7. We'll aim for 5. Maybe I'll give you an extra. Time is a bit short.
Initially, the plan was 7 minutes, but now it's 5. So let me see. Thank you so much for joining. This research, this presentation that I'm giving today is part of a postdoctoral research on breaking down the silos between different agencies working in the dryland, between the humanitarian, the resilience, development, government. So just to mention about what policy implications this has for drylands. And here now, the conversation is about the interaction between the institution and the policies and the people that the policies is going to serve. So this research is done in Kenya, partly in northern Kenya, but the interviews that I did was like in the Horn of Africa, because I had INGO representative from donor, from government. So the case study was particularly in Kenya's northern part, but the implication is for the region. So in a snapshot, I am looking at one particular institution, that is the institution that deals with disaster management, but also the actors within these institutions, because at the end of the day, we always talk about good governance, good policies, but then how do these people interact? How does their hidden dynamics influence how they operate? And how can their relationships influence the outcome? So these are the dynamics that I was exploring to see. We have a good policy, as this table is showing you, how Kenya is ratified to global policies like Paris Agreement. In the region, you have the Africa Regional Strategy, we have the IGAD Disaster Resilience and Sustainability Initiative, and then nationally we have so many policies, and this applies across different countries. And then on this other side of the slide, on the right hand, you see the disaster management institution. So in Kenya, we have the national government, the county, and the local government. So having a roadmap and a strategy is one thing. And the second thing is, how does our relationship or our action and interaction influence how we implement the policies? So this is the whole, in summary, the whole idea about this research on breaking down silos. So for this study, I drew on some literatures, especially in managing large-scale disasters like Hurricane Katrina in the US, and also like earthquake in Japan. And I was seeing what relationship with the local governance and the national authority and the community existed between these disaster operations actors to influence the implementation of the disaster risk management policies and strategies. So on the right side of the slide, you see, on the left side, you see the table, and the table is analyzing these relationships. So on this part, I'm looking at the frequency of the meetings. How do for example, the county government and the national government disaster operation unit, how are they meeting? And how are they communicating to the community? What is the role of community champions? Because at the end of it, we are talking about the dryland, but the policies and the strategies that is used to govern dryland and how these actors communicate is important. And then on the right side of the slide, you have this, I tried to bring it in a framework. By the way, this is a draft. It's submitted to a journal. In case you have any feedback, do get in touch with me, because I'm just trying to figure out what influences and the hidden dynamics within this interaction imply for the policies. So, three things. Number one is the actors, how they communicate, relate, and number two is the relationship between this, and number three, how they operate. For disasters, you are familiar with the three words: the disaster preparedness, disaster response, and recovery. How does this work? So, in the next slide, I want to tell you a few things on where we are in Kenya. Number one, the actors are like the enablers, for example, the donors, those who give funds, the government, INGOs, and UN agencies. These people, for example, if there is a crisis, we mobilize resources and things. I give you a practical example. For my undergraduate, I got a scholarship from one of the Spanish institutions. I never knew the name, but then they paid my university undergraduate money. So just 2 weeks ago, I asked someone who connected me to that institution, what was the name of that agency? Because I never knew, because we never communicated with them. It was just someone mentioned my name, I got this grade, and I got a scholarship. And my fee was paid. I never know who that was. So you see, that person, I am here because that person sponsored my undergrad education, but I don't know them. So that relationship between the enablers and the beneficiary is so much distance. They don't know each other, they don't communicate, and the relationship mostly ends by contracting and subcontracting. So from the high level to the community level, that contracting and subcontracting and quarterly meetings, and the relationship is so much distance. Let me come to the second actors. These are now the implementers, the NGOs, the governments, both departments, and the community-based organizations. For this, the study established that there's great interactions, but often rushed to enhance burn rates, sometimes without careful consideration for disaster preparedness and recovery. Because what I'm looking at is how the disaster preparedness, response, and recovery align. So most of these interactions are aligned towards response. So we see a disaster, we respond, but then through recovery, many fund ends, collapse, the project falls and disappears, and then the interaction is only to the extent of responding. Fine. And then number three is the disaster risk management committees. These are often the community volunteers, and in most of the projects they are called, community champions, community volunteers, health volunteers, land. So every department has. So there's land committee, natural resource committee, health committee, education committee. These ones, they have close interaction. They meet frequently. They also kind of, try to establish relationship. But then here, another question that emerged was level of doing resilience become burdensome, because you have this women group, youth group, every project that comes with a youth group or women group or, the agencies that they want to establish. But then, most of the time, these people are drawn from their daily activities, especially for the dryland, the pastoralists. They have their own activities, they have to manage their heart, they have to, care for the families. But despite this, they are drawn into this resilience building labor. And this labor has implications for them, but also what if the project ends? So these are the questions that we don't ask when we are doing projects. And when we are exiting also, we don't know how we leave these people. Because sometimes the committees that we're establishing, the groups that we're establishing, has also some power relations that emerge from this. And when we leave, then what happened to them? So how do we sustain that relationship? And finally, no. Okay, and then finally, the beneficiaries, and now this is the aspect of rethinking, because we are working with pastoralist communities, and how do they work in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery? And for this study, we found that for them it is a continuous process, and there's deep relationship, you establish relationship based on trust, based on knowledge, and this system exists, and it's something that is maintained over time, over a long time. So it's not the way other forms of institutional actors operate. So I have some quotes here. Unfortunately, I don't think I have time, but one thing I want to say is how tension between operational practices and organizational cultures influence the disaster operation and response. And this is something that we need to be aware of, because sometimes it's difficult to change the way we operate because of the fixed policy terms, fixed strategies, and fixed framework. But in reality, early action and responding to crises in the dryland require flexibility, relationships, trust, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Sorry for the time. Okay, so that was a bunch of different things. We need to disconnects and relationships. Natasha's jumping up, so you want to come up next? Very good. Okay, so that's the first one. We're looking for 5 things. We just want you to stimulate reflection. Think about these things, because we're going to talk about what does it mean. Okay, Natasha, come on up. Let's jump across. If I can find your new slides. Yep. Okay, Natasha, you have to introduce yourself, I think.
That's fine.
Good?
Yeah.
Speak nice into the mic.
All right.
5 minutes?
Sure. I might go really fast through this presentation because I'm on the clock. But just so you know that this work that I'm presenting now, I'll present a part of it now in this session, but there's also an intervention tomorrow afternoon in the session on collective land tenure for the region. And so part of this work I will present also there. So this is the first half. The second half is tomorrow. Come for the second episode. My name is Natasha Maru. I work as the global focal point for rangelands and pastoralists at something called the International Land Coalition. And I'm going to speak about land tenure security for anticipatory action, which involves stuff that Tahira just said, you know, flexibility, relationships, trust, accountability, and those kinds of things. So just quickly, ILC is a coalition or an alliance of organizations. It's one of the biggest in the world. It has several members, but part of, sorry, this slide, something's missing. But ILC's work with rangelands and pastoralists involves essentially 26 pastoralist people's organizations that is supported by civil society organizations and other international organizations. These pastoralist people's organizations represent about 3.5 million people, and these are supported through 10 national platforms, of which there are 5 in Africa that prioritize pastoralism. And then there are 3 regional pastoralist platforms in Central Asia, South Asia, and Africa. There's the Africa Rangelands Initiative that some of you might know. What we do to support our membership is to really leverage some data partnership to offer meaningful data towards people-centered land governance. But we know that land tenure for pastoralists is complex, is specific, is diverse than other systems. So when we speak about securing tenure, we extend that also from beyond land to territory and mobility for pastoralists. And we all know in this room that how important something like this is for effective anticipatory action and for resilient livelihoods, to offer the sort of enabling environment for effective action. Land tenure security is paramount and foundational. And so we see that, this kind of data can really help in resilient livelihoods, adaptation, climate justice, peace and security in the region and elsewhere. So what we've done through the support of Spark and together with data partners, Printex, Landex, ODI, is to develop indicators for assessing and monitoring land tenure security for pastoralists. Now, what do we mean by indicators? Indicators are essentially questions that allow you to assess or examine the extent of land tenure security for pastoralists. And what this land tenure security involves is obviously legal recognition of land tenure for pastoralists, but as well as what that means in practice, in experience, in implementation, and also what that means in perception in terms of the threats that pastoralists might face in having secure tenure in the future. And why are these land tenure indicators important? So these land tenure indicators are important because they serve as a monitoring and assessment tool, right? So you're able to tell at the national and local levels what is the level of land tenure security experienced by pastoralists. And this is also to offer governments data because many governments have obligations to protect land-based communities' rights to their territories. This is also within international frameworks, some of which Tahira and others have also mentioned. So for example, the SDGs require land tenure data to be offered to them. There's the CBD target 22, and all of these frameworks have these sort of monitoring requirements for land tenure security. But at the same time, it's an advocacy and accountability tool. So once you know the extent of land tenure security for pastoralists in the country, you're able to identify gaps in the security and say, okay, we need to fulfill these gaps and national governments need to do better to meet the commitments that they've made. But there's more. We want to go beyond just the descriptive kind of data that can be available, because as we said before, that land tenure security for pastoralists is very specific and we have to nuance the conversation as well. So if we continue to work within mainstream legal frameworks, we might actually tend to do a disservice towards pastoralists. And this is where the rethinking aspect comes in. So we use these indicators also as entry points to advocate for the expansion of legal frameworks, because we incorporate within them the features, the rationality, the logics of pastoralist land tenure use. And these are just the two data partnerships that I spoke about, the platforms on which this data can be made available. So this is the conceptual basis through which we're hoping to do that expansion of legal frameworks that I just spoke about, right? So we know, for example, that for pastoralist land tenure security to be effective, we just don't need rights or individual property rights to bounded or fixed plots of land. We actually need to incorporate things like flexibility, relationality, mobility, and those kinds of things. And so we know that pastoralist land use and access is always collective, is overlapping with other users, and is also temporally defined. We have seasonal grazing areas and things like that. And so when we speak about land tenure security, we want all of these aspects to be secure. Through a long process of working together with grassroots organizations, and this is where the research that ILC does is different from, let's say, researchers here, is where we work in partnerships with organizations to make data directly available and tools like this directly available for them for advocacy, but as well as draw on their insights to develop these kinds of frameworks. So we've assessed through our ground partners that these are some of the aspects that really enable the collective overlapping and temporal use of land. So you need formal recognition, you need to emphasize social cohesion, so ensuring that communities have a spirit of collectivity, have a spirit of social support, and things like that, ensures that land tenure is secure on the ground, that there are local rules and norms set by maybe customary institutions or informally between user groups, that relationships with other users are somewhat secure. And so this could include farmers, and we know that this is a big conflict point, but also neighbors, or like understanding of boundaries that might be contextual. And then there's the perception, or like the kind of perception of security versus threat and disenfranchisement. So I'll stop here and there'll be more tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Super. So we've heard about those kind of these interrelationships that Tahira was talking about. We've heard about land tenure, and we're going to dive now. I think, Nelly, do you want to come and talk about weather and climate information services? We're just jumping around different topics. We're trying to kind of show you different dimensions of this kind of rethinking puzzle. Which slide are you? The grey one. Yeah, there we go. Your name is on it. Okay. So introduce yourself, Nelly. 5 minutes or so.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Or is it still good morning? So I'm very happy to be speaking today to all the people present here, and also just to echo some of the opening statements that have been spoken today morning around challenging everyone in the room around changing the narrative for drylands, because this is exactly what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm Nelly Bosiboi. I'm also with the Massicoa team as the Senior Climate Change Advisor. I have 2 slides to present, and in the interest of time, I would like to spend just 1 minute to give you some context to the findings that I'm going to be speaking to today. So just recently, I had the opportunity with my colleague Sam from ILRI to have a very candid conversation in Wajir County. This was as a result of a workshop that we had, a Spark workshop that we had earlier on in the year. I'm sure some of you attended the workshop. And really, the intention for this conversation in Wajir County was to move from research to action. We've already had some speakers speaking to it this morning. So I had the opportunity to sit down with the county representatives from all the different thematic sectors. There was KMB in the room, NDMA, a very vibrant local representation. We had the local community radio in the room, private sector, other NGOs, and also UN agencies in the room, just to really unpack what that weather and climate information services ecosystem for Wajir County looks like. And the intention was really to map out the application and use of weather and climate information systems in the room. So just some key highlights before I move into my slides. One of the key things we really wanted to unpack was to understand how they use this information, because I think the mapping from the global level, the frameworks and all that is very well laid out. So the intention was really to understand when this information comes from KMD, NDMA has their own information as well. It lands at the counties and other stakeholders in the county. What does that information, what is it used for? So very interesting. They use this information to do water tracking programs, which is exciting. So they plan around what are some of the areas that might have hotspot areas in terms of population concentration, or if it's during the floods, areas that might be inaccessible, then those populations need to be planned for in terms of water tracking. They also use weather and climate information services for planning meetings. We heard about the Pastoral Leadership Summit. I think the dates also had to be changed because of some of the advisories that were coming from KMD. They use it for education, like when they have national exams, in terms of how the examination papers are distributed across the county. Also in terms of livestock feeds, vaccination cycles, livestock off-take programs, as well as advisories on dry planting, whether to do dry planting or not. It was very encouraging to see that weather and climate information services is actually being used at that county level and community level. So I'm also very excited to be speaking, to be bringing all these voices into this conversation today, because one of the key challenges that the main takeaways from the meeting was that there isn't enough understanding of what that ecosystem looks like in terms of when you're designing weather and climate information services interventions. And so we had a great time of really looking into some of the bottlenecks, as much as it was good to identify and see that there's some useful case studies where this information is used to make impactful decisions. There's also some key bottlenecks that need to be tangled as part of the way of moving this conversation forward. So one of the key things that came out was the limited linkage of weather and climate information services, products to anticipatory action. Really that there's that recognition that the next step needs to be, designing and planning around anticipatory action. But most of the stakeholders in the room acknowledged and said that they acknowledge the principle, it is a good principle, but there needs to be a lot of work to really unpack what does that actually mean. So that the counties are well guided, the CSOs, CBOs, even the communities really have that structure and systems to be able to move into the anticipatory action. Also, there was highlighted that there is no feedback loop to provide feedback and information from KMD. There has been some successes with co-production, with the participatory scenario planning, which is not very consistent. So there is hope there that such a scenario could work. But then there needs to be more investment to ensure that the PSPs are consistent and that there's actually feedback back to KMD to say, this information that you're giving out is useful to us or it's not useful, or it could be useful if it's produced in a certain way. Thirdly, there's also the issue around limited funding for weather and climate information services, especially at the county level. They've indeed recognized that the CIDP doesn't have specific budgets for weather and climate information services. And if you're not in the planning documents, obviously it will not be considered in the budget allocations. So that also needs to be addressed similarly for all the other stakeholders in terms of just having things like dedicated funding for anticipatory action when it's needed. And then fourthly, there's also low trust in climate information, partly because of cultural and religious beliefs. And so there's need to really work on co-production or really a lot of promotion to see how cultural and indigenous technical knowledge can merge with the scientific information to improve that trust and also ultimately improve the usability of climate information. Also, inadequate infrastructure. It was good to have a community radio in the room. They're doing fantastic work around disseminating the advisories to the communities, but there's challenges because the infrastructure, the radio frequency doesn't cover the whole county. It covers just about a third of the county. So there's need for supporting such community organizations in terms of infrastructure and technology to ensure that then they have that enabling environmental infrastructure to really disseminate this information. And also for KMD, they do not have adequate automated weather stations, as well as other weather stations that can really contribute to increasing or improving the quality of the information that they use to provide the advice, the bulletins. And then, of course, yes, I have one more slide. Limited multi-sectoral stakeholder coordination structures. So we have other sectors like health, education, and even communication. At the structured government institutional level, there's not adequate collaboration between all these stakeholders. So they challenge around siloed planning and implementation of projects relating to weather and climate information services. But of course, there was highlights that this a great missed opportunity that has potential to unlock what the climate information services can actually offer. So just in terms of looking forward, we also had a great deal of discussions in terms of really unpacking to see what the future could be in terms of opportunities for improving weather and climate information services application and use in Wajir County. Of course, there was a suggestion to have at the county level a coordinated system or structure, of course building on the current structures that are already there, the CSG, to see how they can bring in more stakeholders from the other sectors to really plan coherently, as well as the issue around budgeting to try and see how one organization can cover something while the other covers to ensure sustained activities for the communities. Also promotion of social behavior change programs. This is particularly important because of the mismatch between what the science says and what the social cultural beliefs would be. So really there needs to be a lot of work to be done with the communities to really understand where the religious leaders are coming from or traditional leaders, and then trying to see how that can be merged to increase the acceptance and use of weather and climate information. And then also, of course, the budgeting, I've spoken to that. Also, fourth is mainstreaming indigenous technical knowledge into the co-production. Really, the feedback we received is that this is just being mentioned as a tick box, just recognizing that indigenous technical knowledge is powerful and can be used in weather and climate information services, but there's little action at the ground level to really integrate all this, the two different sides of information to see how that can improve access and use. And then, of course, communication and outreach of weather and climate information services is very important. One thing that was clear for me is that at that community level, county level, and going down all the way to the community level, there's not a much documentation to really bring out the different, it is a very intricate ecosystem, because I've seen most of the research articles or publications just, there's a box for community members or for pastoralists. But that is it's a very intricate ecosystem that needs to be broken further down to various different community groups and interests, so that then if you're developing weather advisories, they will be targeted to that specific community or target group, of course, in the local language, and also strengthening anticipatory action and structure. But just in closing, because I see Peter is up, the main message that we have from Wajir is that there was a lot of hope in the room to say weather and climate information services has the opportunity to change, to bring real change to the livelihoods and day-to-day activities of pastoralists, but a lot needs to be done, especially around redefining. This was spoken to earlier today, redefining. For us to really go back to the grassroots and map out and see, are these people, purely pastoralists? Do they move around? How do they move around? I think that narrative that we're using was for so many years ago. With technological advancements and sociocultural change, a lot has changed, and that means we really need to redefine that narrative, understand the communities very well, and then from that we can now move ahead to form, advisories or weather climate information that is actually targeted to the actual communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. I can see that we're redefining what 7 minutes means. It was 5 and it became 7, became 5, between 7. Let's move on. Let's jump across. Alex, you're going to come next. So we're going to hear another angle, another perspective on all of this. I'm not sure what your one looks like. Alex, that's your name, Alex.
Well, yeah, okay.
That helps. Do you want to use it?
Yeah, we'll use it. I told Peter that slides, I would only do slides if everybody else did slides. So everybody else did slides, so I apologize in advance. These might not be as beautiful as my colleagues. Thanks, I'm Alex Humphrey from Mercy Corps' Global Research and Learning Team. We're part of the SPARK Consortium, and I'm here just to tell you briefly about some learning from SPARK about how anticipatory action in the drylands is uniquely challenging, and to share a few lessons about what we think might be needed to make it more kind of relevant from the perspectives of pastoralists themselves. So to start, I want to take you all back to early 2022, and I'm sure you'll remember that there were forecasts then predicting a pretty dire drought in the Horn. So at that time, a group of us in SPARK, led by Simon, who's in the back of the room, and Jameel, my friend here, came together to conduct a longitudinal piece of research that interviewed a panel of pastoralists over the progression of the drought crisis. And we wanted to understand, what pastoralists were doing to prepare for this forecasted drought. And with that information, we hope to identify clear kind of windows of opportunity for anticipatory assistance. And I think it's fair to say that our findings really challenged some of the assumptions that we set out with. And I think to help maybe frame some of the debates and discussions that need to be the focus of this sector going forward. So briefly, a few things that we learned. One, we learned that pastoralists' approaches to making decisions under uncertainty is highly subjective. And it comes down to a series of very difficult, maybe even impossible trade-offs and kind of varied perceptions of risk. So we heard a lot of people telling us about the difficulty of making decisions about migration, for example, ahead of a forecasted drought. Should I move my animals now and then risk losses unnecessary losses in case the rains do come? Or do I stay put and wait for more information, but maybe by that time it's too late and my animals will be too weak to migrate? The second thing we learned is that there are real structural constraints that limit people's options for being more proactive than they already are. And many people, for example, wanted to stockpile fodder ahead of the drought based on what they were reading in the forecast, but they couldn't because the local markets could not supply that fodder at the scale that was needed. And a cross-cutting theme, I think, throughout the research also was that cash or resources weren't necessarily the main barrier to anticipatory action. In many cases, cash would not have made those decisions easier, or they wouldn't have unlocked further anticipatory action because of those structural constraints that I was talking about. So take that for what it is. I think it means that there's often not clear windows of opportunity for anticipatory action in the drylands. And there's also a real tension, I think, between some of the technocratic models or approaches to anticipatory action based on, forecasts, triggers, disbursements, and the highly relational and informal and social way that people make decisions about their livelihoods ahead of crises. So how can we start to address this? I think there's a few learnings from Spark that I'll just share. I think the first one is to recognize that pastoralists are already anticipatory, but their form of anticipation doesn't always cleanly map onto the logic of formal anticipatory action. And that logic, as I mentioned before, tends to treat anticipation as this kind of specific standalone strategy that comes into play ahead of a forecasted shock. But instead, anticipation in the drylands, I think, is a part of an ongoing, usually informal, highly relational process. It's not centralized. It's not necessarily linear. Take migration again, for example. Moving animals before a drought isn't just about shifting patterns of migration. It's about kind of an ongoing process of negotiating access with clan elders or local authorities. So decisions are relational, again, embedded in trust and reciprocity. So what does that mean for AA actors? I think beginning to recognize and attempting to build or reinforce those local systems and strategies is the key. And too often we're approaching AA as this kind of technocratic innovation that relies on these external models. And really what we need to be doing is connecting financing and forecasting to what people are already doing. The second thing here is, again, this issue of structural constraints and how they limit what might be possible. So even when a forecast comes out and it screams, act now to prepare, there's often very limited options for kind of dramatic or transformative adaptation or proactivity. In Somalia, again, herders weren't able to buy that fodder to stockpile it because of structural limitations in the markets, or perhaps conflict is limiting mobility. So those sorts of obstacles can't be addressed by AA, no matter how well it's timed, right? So they're really systemic bottlenecks that really fundamentally limit the potential of AA as it's currently conceived in the drylands. And I think it's an important reminder that AA cannot just be about releasing funding earlier. It needs to be matched with these kind of longer term investments and building the systems that make anticipation possible. Let's see, I realize that, am I okay? Yeah. One more minute, okay, cool. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is this issue of working with informality and ensuring that we're being sufficiently flexible in our approaches in terms of dealing with AA. Informal systems are really at the root of how people anticipate and act in the drylands, as others have been saying. Anticipation, we learned through our research, really depends on social networks. It depends on mutual aid, trust-based arrangements. So what we tend to do is bypass those things in the way that we're delivering AA now. And I think there's some clear opportunities to leverage those things and support them instead. So just a couple practical examples, we could be, instead of focusing on these beneficiary lists or really careful targeting at the household level ahead of a crisis, we could be trying to deliver cash assistance to groups that already exist and allow them to redistribute that on their own terms. Or take remittances, for example, which we know are critical to anticipation in the drylands. Maybe we can look at trying to lower the transfer costs or match remittances that are coming from the diaspora in the way that we deliver aid. So the message there is kind of the same, channeling resources through systems that people already use, already trust. I had some more to say about flexibility. I think I'll let colleagues cover that because I'm out of time, but I just wanted to finish on a positive note and say, there's a ton of interest in AA. There's lots of AA pilots happening on a small scale. There's interested donors in investing in this stuff. I think typically those pilots are looking to build efficiency into the system, usually using technology. That's exciting, that's great, but I think we may be missing an opportunity to also try and address some of these more structural or systemic issues that are especially relevant in the dryland. So there's a few examples, I think, of evidence gaps on the slides here, making sure that AA is addressing multi-hazard contexts, looking for ways for AA to reinforce these local informal systems, and this issue of balancing speed and efficiency with local relevance, I think, is also critical. So I'll leave it at that. And the ... means there's millions more, and I think many of you could share some thoughts on that with us. I'd love to talk more with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, super. So I hope you're kind of tapping into all these different strands of the conversation. So Sam is going to come up, and I don't know whether you're going to wrap everything together, Sam, but you don't have to. Give us a kind of, so this is the 5th final short presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very hard to go last after all those really brilliant presentations. I thought I would just try to summarize some of the key insights from our own research at the Jameel Observatory over the last couple of years, but also some of the wider research programs that have been ongoing and that we've been collaborating very closely with. And you've had a lot of insights from those, from the presenters that precede me. So I thought I'd just summarize some key messages, think about what we know about pastoralism already and how these key messages link to that, and what the implications are. So 3 key messages and then just 3 sort of key implications. The first thing is this question of knowing when to act versus knowing what to do. And I think one very clear message coming across from our own research and lots of other research going on is that even with very good forecasts, it's never straightforward to determine exactly what to do in the drylands, in pastoralist contexts. And that's particularly the case in drought contexts, which is obviously a gradually onset disaster with a very unpredictable trajectory, as Alex was just saying, and it often intersects with all kinds of other disasters, crises ongoing at the same time. And more widely, pastoralism is obviously a livelihood which involves high degrees of physical mobility, but also economic flexibility. Often people are moving between different livelihoods in a very opportunistic, dynamic way. And all of this means that this link between predefined triggers and action plans is often not straightforward. I think just echoing what Alex said there, effective early action, effective anticipatory action is not something that can straightforwardly just be switched on once a threshold has reached. It needs to be adaptive, it needs to be responsive to these dynamically transforming situations and crises. The second point is around this question of how we target actions. And I think lots of what people have spoken about today reflects this point that livelihoods in the drylands are established on collective institutions. Land is collectively owned and managed. Locally led social assistance is shaped by collective institutions, all established on obligation, reciprocity, solidarity. Vulnerability in that sense is something that's collectively experienced and managed usually through practices of sharing, redistribution, moral economy practices. So what implications does that have for how we target our actions, our anticipatory actions? I think in a general sense, there's often a mismatch. Often anticipatory action plans are built around this idea that risk and vulnerability are individualized, straightforwardly measurable at the level of the household. And in practice, interventions are always absorbed into these wider collective logics of redistribution. So rather than seeing that as a leakage, maybe anticipatory action could begin to learn from these collective practices and work with them rather than against them. How does that look? Well, as Alex was saying, potentially it's targeting assistance to existing groups or collectively managed resources like water infrastructure. My final general point is around this question of services. A lot of different research, including my own, emphasizes how important informal, locally rendered forms of service, basically services are in the drylands to pastoralists. Particularly in managing crisis. Everything from lorry drivers who travel to remote locations to sell food, motorbike riders who scout for new pasture, operators in informal ambulance service, carry young or sick animals to new grazing sites, drivers who can translate the names of medicines into different languages and then buy medicines and bring them back to remote villages. All of these people, kiosk owners who give interest-free loans based on social capital, all of these people provide essential services which are critical to how people manage crises in the drylands. They're all informal. My colleague Tahira would probably call them high reliability professionals. And I think a key point here is that there are always local systems that are very effective, very locally accountable. And so a key question is, how can anticipatory action do better at orienting itself towards these existing systems, with a view to having more impact and potentially having lower cost? So what are the answers to all these things? Just wrapping up here, I think one thing that we feel at Jameel Observatory is that anticipatory action in the drylands, what we understand about it and what we understand about pastoralist contexts, there's a call for a more clearly defined set of guidance or core principles around what works and what factors need to be considered when designing anticipatory action protocols in the drylands. And I think most of the people we need to think around those sorts of principles or guiding ideas are with us today. So we'd be very open to having a conversation about that. The idea there would be to develop some kind of core principles that would complement existing roadmaps and structure them in the drylands and in pastoralist livelihoods. More widely, our work at the Jameel Observatory is obviously focused a lot on knowledge exchange and capacity building. And I think effective anticipatory action is often something that emerges from innovation at the level of the local authority. There's a very good report coming out from Mickey Nassef and Simon Levine from the Spark program, which really gives some very clear examples of how that works at the level of local authorities. And I think the work that Nelly Bossibori just mentioned also speaks to this point, that there's lots of innovation and work going on at the level of local authorities in Kenya, at the level of county governments. And so this is sort of one case among many of where we see our convening role and our capacity building work. And then I guess my final point is just about targeted research. I think anticipatory action is here with us to stay. And I think, as Alex was saying, there's a lot of interest and lots of innovation and pilot projects going on. And I think there's a need for targeted research now in areas like pastoralist decision making, how forecasts are used in local contexts, and many other things. And I hope that we can make progress on those issues together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Good. Okay. Thinking a little longer for the short presentations, but they're all really interesting. We heard about relations, tenure, information, informality, collectivity, amongst other things. We're going to give you a chance in a moment to discuss some of these. I'm looking for two colleagues, Kadar, Guyer. Could you guys come up here, please? No laptops needed. So we've asked these two gentlemen, they play different roles in their organizations, to give us a quick, what does this mean for me? So Kadar, could you come up here? Maybe grab a nice seat, and I'll bring you the mic. So we've got Kadar from Somalia. He will give you his full name. He works for the Somali Disaster Management Agency, SODMA, and Guyo is working for ICPAL, who we all know, and he's the drylands research lead, and I think Kadar leads on disaster response management. So Kadar, why don't you start? Why don't you come up at the microphone? We're going to give you a few minutes, react to what you've heard. You are a practitioner, you manage your government's response to disasters. Where does all this fit? What does it mean for you? Just a few minutes, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, I thank you for, of course, participating in this session. My name is Khadar Sheikh Mohammed. I'm Director for Disaster Risk Management at SODMA, that's Somalia Disaster Management Agency. Of course, there is where my department is where anticipatory action is anchored, and among others, the early warning systems and so on. So I have been, of course, listening to the presenters, and I thank them for raising a lot that has been internally discussed at the local level as well as the national level. Of course, as practitioners, we rely on researchers to give us the solutions, which could be, of course, relentlessly dispatched to the communities. So it could be a solution for everything except doing no harm. the reimagining, or should I say rethinking. Rethinking is the right word actually, and I thank whoever has invented to, of course, start the wording which we have here. Of course, the world we live in, especially the dry land, is not as same as 10 years ago. It's not. It's neither as same as 50 years ago. It's changing. Of course, with climate that we blame, but also the human interference is also a factor. So diversification of the livelihoods that we depended on is not much intensified. Of course, our communities have always been mobile. For example, the community which I'm descending from, the Somali community, wherever they are, especially in the Republic of Somalia, they are mobile to, of course, have some resilience and, of course, depend on, of course, the livelihood that they lead. The governance and the structural, governance which is existing is also somehow mindful of the importance of pastoralism in our country, which according to the development and reconstruction fund tells us that the pastoralism, the livestock sector is about 78% of our GDP. Of course, it also says I also, according to that particular bank, it also says that from 2018 to 2024, Somalia has exported about 20 million heads of sheep and goods. Of course, those are the small ruminant. What about the other big ruminants? Of course, there's also another number. About that, there has been several years that they felt they, of course, faced hardship, especially 2021, 2022 drought, which has been very persistent. It was also, said to be the worst in 40 years in our region, especially Somalia. Therefore, that has decimated the number of livestock that, that are headed by our pastoralists. The dry land is getting drier. Of course, we have also experienced around, we say 5 to 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons in those 2 years. And therefore, learning from the past is something that is sufficient for us to plan in the future. And that's why I was saying, as practitioners, we rely on you, on most of you, the researchers, of course, to give us, some working solutions. So it depends on our survival. Of course, early warning systems are integral part. Of course, some of the presenters have also already been convincing us that early warning systems in terms of triggering anticipatory action is something that is, of course, that's also something that we could rely on in terms of rethinking the way we lived for several years. Investing into a tailored and people-centered early warning is also an integral part in the integral part which anticipatory action functionality depends on. Recently, we've developed so many hazard-based, or should I say multi-hazard frameworks. Also, we are developing the roadmap currently, the Somalia Anticipatory Action Roadmap, which encompasses the different sectors as well as the different hazards, especially the one that gives us the headache, the drought, the dry seasons. Of course, the survival of the transhumans is not also the same. Now, the land is shrinking, and I'm happy that, you know, the land on tenure is also discussed here. The land within the countries are also shrinking. So pastoralists have no, you know, grazing ground that's enough, that's sufficient for them in terms of seasonality anymore, as well as the boundary, of course, borderlands are also not that safe anymore. Of course, we also talk about the rustling, the animal livestock rustling. Conflicts are also there. So I know I don't have time, but I would conclude my little remark by saying that this is the place to start with rethinking or reimagining the way we live. So diversification of livelihood is something that could also be a solution, and anticipatory action is also the head of the body. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry for the time is short. Huh? Good. Okay. Let's move. Let me hear from Guyo Balija Roba. Used to be my boss, but now he's moved to a new boss. Drylands, pastoralism. Your thoughts? What does this mean? Guyo.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think my name is Guyo Roba. I think I know quite a number of people in this room. Yes, I'll try my best to cover. Very interesting presentation. Brought a lot of issues, and I'm actually interested to see what you can pull from this. But for me, I think few points. One, I think pastoralists are one of the most over-researched groups. The evidence that are coming is quite overwhelming. But then the question is, what do we need to do more? Do we need to generate more evidence? Do we need to act on the evidence that are on the floor? I think when you know, Yarso was doing the framing presentation, I said, being in this space for quite a long time, we've heard a lot about these things. What is new that you're saying in different way? What is the new thinking? So, but then there's the other side, which I think in the cross-cutting across all presentation is attempt to place pastoralists at the center of early warning information in constructing the new construct of anticipatory action. Is the question of many of us in this space have a conceptual thinking, and that conceptual thinking becomes problematic when we want to implement with people. Then we go back to redefine our conceptual thinking, and then this co-creation conversation comes up. But then, how genuine is the co-creation processes? I give you a very good example. In the early warning within the pastoral communities, people have traditionally invested in a system that is based on scout. Scouts are people go and physically check the attributes of the landscape, the behavior of the animals, the body condition of the animals, and then they don't make that decision quickly. It's a long triangulation processes. That's a complex process. We have a simple process that is trying to unpack the complexity of decision making. That is why early warning need to rethink how do you mimic some of these attributes that people use to construct your own early warning system, because you will always talk about trust as a big issue. You'll talk about uptake, low uptake of early warning. It keeps on continuing that. I think on one of the presentation, in Tahira's presentation, I think on the interaction, it's very interesting study to know that there are quite a number of actors, multi-layered, macro, micro, meso, all the levels. And that's the complexity of disaster risk responses. My big question is, where's the leadership in all this complexity? Leadership defines how these things are structured. Unless we question that, who is the authority, who should lead what, I think then it will benefit from the understanding of the tension between actors and also the positive between actors. We can amplify that. The other part of the study that I picked up from my own historical way of looking at things is a cross-cutting theme between studies talking about formality and informality. in the land range systems, the moment you start with informality, you lower one science below the formal science. And I think formal formality is already pregnant with a lot of problem. And that problem moved from evidence to policy positioning. So you find the informality of pastoral systems in terms of understanding the dynamics of how people use resources and how they generate indicators, then become a problem. That is why, and it leads me to Natasha's presentation, who constructs the indicators? Are you fixing the indicators and then looking for the land users to use the indicators, or are you borrowing or building indicators from people and trying to look at how other people fit in? I think there's a quite shift recently in these construction processes of embedding the indicators, whatever you want to do, whether it's in early warning information systems, from the community and trying to see how others fit in. We've done a lot from above. We need to see how these indicators work from below. And I think as I conclude, because Peter is really struggling with his time, Sam's presentation is very interesting. I think he touched on something that I've always been asking myself. The entire construct of anticipatory action is coming from an established science elsewhere. That established science elsewhere does not have commonality or homogeneity in applying between slow onset disaster and rapid onset disasters. So, but then the AA principles are applied in a community with a different context of response, culturally, everything. So I think for me, the best question is, the principles are very good thinking, but how do you construct the principles? To me, I think that would be very interesting. And how do you define the usabilities of some of these principles? I think we've done that in the range sciences on some of the fundamental principles, but then people always, the contemporary science, always take shortcut away from these principles. So for me, I think borrowing from the previous mistakes, take an opportunity, try to build very authentic principles with people, and then building it to a level where it can be applied, the practicalities, the cost of applying principles. It shouldn't be very complex. So, but I think it's a very good thinking. I think it's the thinking in the right direction. I'll stop there. I have a lot to say, but then I'm given 3 minutes. I just stop there.